Welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Arran Rogerson.
And I'm Alyssa Polizzi.
Today we're talking about a metaphor, the rider and the elephant. This metaphor has been floating around in various forms for a very long time, I think, maybe even since the ancient Greeks. The notion of the rider and the horse, or the man and the monster, some kind of metaphor describing a higher form of the self and a lower form of the self, or a more reasonable version of the self and a more kind of unreasonable, passionate, emotional version of the self. And this metaphor is problematic. It doesn't transfer over super easily to a lot of the concepts that we often throw around in psychology, like rational and emotional, or ego and unconscious, et cetera, et cetera. But this metaphor is useful because it's understandable and you can play with it. And it actually demonstrates a dynamic that I think can bring some awareness into people's general behavior, people's general psychology. You can understand people better if you think about this metaphor. You can understand your relationships better, and you can understand yourself and maybe approach yourself, working with yourself, developing better habits by using this metaphor as a framework, you might say.
Yeah, I think we'll spend the majority of this episode sort of talking through this metaphor because it is helpful, and especially the visual, I think we should get into more and really just kind of project into our minds this idea of us walking around with this big animal that we're not in control of. But in preparation for this episode, we've been talking a little bit more about what it actually means, and it's not that we disagree.
No, I wouldn't say that, but we're arguing a lot, and Alyssa and I operate from different paradigms, and we also have different minds, and I tend to have a more zoomed out, sort of systematic, synthesizing mind that looks at everything in this very grandiose, like spread thin kind of way, and I think she has a more kind of narrow and deep understanding of... she has a system that's a little more narrow, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's partly why we have trouble coming up with topics often, is because I'm trying to come from like bird's eye down, and she's coming from like worm's view up, you might say. Anyways, we digress. So the rider and the elephant, the image of the rider and the elephant is there's a gigantic beast, and this beast weighs a lot. It's incredibly strong. It's an animal. It wants what it wants. It follows its instincts. It might eat something off the ground without thinking about it. It might get spooked and run away. It might try scratching its back against a sacred piece of art without realizing what it's doing. And then there's the rider, which is someone who is maybe what we think of as being more human or smarter or more rational, more aware. And that person is trying to ride the elephant, or maybe in this metaphor, they have to ride the elephant. So you have a man who can think, who can see, who understands the world, who has certain ideas about what should happen. He is wise. He knows the right path to take. But he's on top of the elephant, and the elephant maybe doesn't want to go down that path. The elephant maybe wants to go where it wants to go. And this metaphor maps on to us because we have a higher self that we often think of as being the more rational or reasonable self, the more aware self, the more conscious self. I think it maps on pretty well to the ego and the unconscious. Alyssa and I have some disagreements about that maybe, but that's part of the fun of this episode, is teasing out those differences. But basically you have a higher self, the ego, I would say, which maps onto the rider. And then you have a lower self, a more animalistic self, a more emotional feeling self, which maps onto the unconscious.
I think I think what I struggle with just utilizing the terms of ego and unconscious, even though I agree a lot, I really do, is that there seems to be more of the classification of the writer being the rational mind and the elephant being the emotional mind. I think even if you just sort of Google this metaphor, that's a lot of what you'll find in these like random articles.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that they've got it right, but
yeah, we don't have it right either. And so like we're certainly not guaranteeing that we're using this metaphor properly. And you might have read a book on this and might say they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
We acknowledge that.
Yeah, well,
and we don't care.
Yeah, we're just exploring.
We do care. We want to be right, but what I'm saying is that we're going to talk about this anyways.
Yeah.
And we might be talking about it wrong, but I think it's a fun metaphor to explore.
Yeah. To me, the ego at its core is the seat of consciousness. It is conscious awareness.
Yeah.
And that does not necessarily mean that it's rational. It can rationalize.
Yeah.
Certainly it can think things through and it can take in certain information and try to make sense of it and make decisions. But we recognize in a lot of the paradigm that we've been talking about on this podcast, mostly from the Jungian framework, that the ego thinks it's in control and thinks it understands things or thinks that it's making its own choices because it's decided that. And yet there's this whole other bottom of the iceberg, and that's the unconscious.
Right.
So I enjoy the metaphor of the rider and the elephant. But when it's when the dichotomy is like emotional versus rational, I'm like,
it's problematic.
Yeah, it's a little problematic for me.
Rational as a term, I think, is already problematic. And I think a lot of people aren't using that word properly, or they don't even know what they really mean when they say it.
Yeah.
And same with emotions. It's when you ask someone to define what they mean by emotion, people often don't know how to respond to that.
Yeah, that's
it's
really
like, well,
hard.
it's self-evident.
Right.
Emotions.
Yeah,
we all know what those are. It's like, well, okay, yeah, but we're trying to get into like the specific psychology of it. And it's like, well, I don't know. It's just, it's like you feel angry or sad or something, and that's emotions.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, fair enough, but that's a basic understanding. But anyways, it's problematic to think about it as emotion and rationality. That's oversimplified, and I think that will lead you down the wrong path if you try to unpack psychology into that dualism.
Yeah.
But the rider and the elephant to me is pointing at something that is kind of more vague and basic, which is like there's a higher self and there's a lower self.
Okay, but I have like a little bit of an issue.
Sure.
Unless like higher self is like the tip of the iceberg and it's just there and you can see it. But like, I feel like a lot of people have an association with like higher self being like the realized version of you, the higher self. And I'm like, the ego is not that. So.
Right, the levitating Buddha is like the higher self.
I know
right?
that's not what you mean, but I just want to clarify that for anybody listening.
I mean, that's the trouble with psychology is that it's so complex that there's constant terminological disputes.
Sure.
Like, what do we even mean when we say higher self?
Yeah.
What do we mean when we say self? Like, we already talked about that.
Oh my God, yeah.
That was problematic. Who is the self?
Yeah.
Is the self the ego?
Yeah.
Is it what I think of when I think of I?
Yeah.
Not exactly. Well, is it like the unconscious? Like, kind of. What about the notion of like the ascended self, the person you were trying to become?
Yeah.
We had an episode called Higher Self. Mm-hmm. So there you go. I'm already having a terminological dispute with myself. Anyways,
but we mean like the conscious self,
yes,
that which we are aware of,
right. There's
thinking mind.
Right. And again, higher and lower is a metaphor, right?
Yes,
because there isn't actually like a geographical orientation as much as it's sort of metaphorically. There's a part of you that's more conscious and there's a part of you that's more unconscious. And it's intuitive to think of those as having a depth.
Yeah.
One is surface.
Yes.
One is deep below the surface.
Yes.
Anyways, all that aside, what we're talking about is something I think you can recognize pretty easily if you think about it, which is that a lot of our behavior doesn't seem to be exactly what we want from ourselves. People do tend to believe they tend to at least describe themselves as being in complete control. Yeah. Very few people like to acknowledge that they're not in control of themselves. That's a scary thing to acknowledge to yourself, but it's mostly true. We don't know how to force ourselves to do absolutely everything we want to force ourselves to do. And one of the most extreme examples I would say is someone who has an addiction. This is an extreme example. We can start here. It's kind of contrived, but it's good to start extreme. Someone who's addicted to smoking cigarettes, for instance, they can't simply decide to stop smoking. Gotta be careful with the terminology here, but let's say the rider, so the man on top of the elephant who has the reins, who is trying to guide the elephant in a direction, that person is like the ego, I would say, or like the autobiographical I, and they might say, you know what, I should quit smoking.
Yeah.
Snap my fingers. I'm done smoking forever. I've decided it.
Yeah.
And some people do this. They convince themselves that, I can just decide to quit. And then 30 minutes later, man, I need a cigarette. And they smoke.
Yeah.
And it's like, what happened?
The elephant's big trunk, just went into the jacket pocket
Exactly.
and pulled out a cigarette
and
started smoking it.
Exactly. So let's try to stick with the metaphor as much as possible during this episode. But it's like the elephant is...
I'm still laughing. Sorry.
No, it's good. The rider is like, okay, we are done smoking. Me and the elephant will never smoke again. And the rider might actually know how to do that. The rider's like, yeah, no more cigarettes.
Yeah.
And then he's like, all right, let's keep on our adventure, Mr. Elephant. And then he sees the elephant's smoking a cigarette. Right. And he's like, what are you... We decided we were done, elephant. And the elephant's not listening because it's an elephant. It's just smoking cigarettes. Which is a pretty funny image, right?
Very
would
funny.
It smoke through the trunk or would it smoke through the mouth?
I don't know.
Okay, we're going to get too distracted here. But the idea that the elephant isn't listening to the rider, the elephant wants a cigarette, and so the elephant smokes anyways. And the rider's like, what are you doing? We decided we were quitting. What this illustrates is that you can't just decide to quit smoking. And when you try, you fail. And maybe you quit for 6 months and then you have a relapse and you start smoking again.
Yeah.
And there's all these ways in which people are like, I have this bad habit and I don't know how to stop.
Yeah.
I need help.
Yeah.
I cannot tell myself to stop doing this. I cannot get myself to stop doing this.
Yeah.
What does that mean when you can't get yourself to do something? It's like, at first, if you say that, it seems ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like the idea of I can't convince myself to do what I want to do. That's ridiculous. Of course I can. It's like, well, no, actually you can't. It's not as easy as you think to get yourself to do something that you think you should do. Yeah. In fact, you fail at it all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe you're just not paying attention. Or maybe you actually are really, really disciplined and really in control of your life. Of course, there are people who are incredibly disciplined out there and who can do things like quit smoking cold turkey. But we're not talking about them. We're talking about the average person who thinks they're in control of themselves, and yet they find that they can't control themselves.
Right. So the elephant in this case has been trained to become dependent on this cigarette. Yeah. And the will of the rider, it will not overcome the needs of the elephant. Right. And it seems that this is a mental model and a metaphor that's applicable to a lot of behavioral psychology. Yeah. In a way that we can look at these different behaviors and understand why it is we struggle. So then the question is, what do we do? How can we slowly wean the elephant off of cigarettes?
Right. So the rider, one way to think about this, I think, is the rider is sort of like a representative of the elephant. The rider serves the elephant. Yes. The rider is, in some ways you can think of the rider, I think, as being like a public relations agent for the elephant. And if you go to someone to talk to them, you're sort of talking to the rider. I say, hey man, I think you should quit smoking. The person, the other individual might respond, you're right, I'm going to quit. But I'm talking to the rider. I'm talking to the conscious self. I'm talking to the egoic self. I'm talking to the one who's convinced he's in charge. Yeah. And then we have a conversation and we've agreed. Me and the other individual, we've agreed that he's going to quit smoking. And he's like, I'm going to do it. But I'm not talking to the elephant. The elephant is the one with the addiction. The elephant is the instinct, the deeper emotions, the deeper conditioning. The elephant is often the trauma, the body, the things that are sort of ingrained in you. That's the elephant. And so I'm not talking to the elephant when I'm having a conversation about quitting smoking, when I'm having a conversation with this individual about quitting smoking, excuse me. And so what can happen there, something that could happen is that the other individual might, let's say, check themselves into rehab. And what are they doing there? It's like they're actually essentially leading the elephant into a cage and saying, okay, you're stuck here now. And the elephant's going to freak out and it's going to be like, I want a cigarette, I want a cigarette, I want a cigarette. But it can't get one because it's in rehab.
Yeah.
It's locked up. And so it's like the rider has somehow taken control by tricking the self into doing something that all the instincts and emotions don't actually want. And that's an extreme example.
Yeah. Well, I think that on an everyday experience, we have to recognize that the elephant that's been trained, you know, by whatever situation to act the way that it acts or to desire the things that it desires, to need those elements, must then have a process of kind of negotiation, almost like diplomacy, you might say, of how can we motivate the elephant to start working with the rider. And I think that that's maybe the point at the heart of this, is that we're recognizing that consciousness, or who we are in totality, is divided. And so when we are divided against ourselves, those pieces might be in opposition. So how can they get on the same path?
Right.
And how can the rider recognize that the elephant has these learned tendencies now, and it can't just change, you know, right off the bat. So how do you motivate the elephant? It's like, well, if you don't smoke, you get this instead, you know, like you start to play these little games with yourself almost, you might say. And also the rider needs to have like that clear goal at the same time. You know, why are we taking this new direction in our life, rider? You know, because, you know, our doctor says we're worried about our health. You know, you start looking at these different ways that you can frame the need for these behavioral changes and set yourself up for success by working with both the rider and the elephant.
Right. Setting up a path that makes it easier for the elephant to go in that direction.
Yeah.
Setting up the environment so the elephant is going to do what you think it should do.
Right. Reduce the obstacles.
Reducing the obstacles. So let's do some more examples of this.
Okay.
To illustrate the concept, because I still think this is a pretty easy metaphor, but at the same time it is kind of confusing.
Yeah,
so,
something a little bit more subtle.
Yeah. Another good example I would say is that someone is in a romantic relationship, and they've gotten so fed up with their partner that they're convinced that they would be better off without their partner, let's say. And so what they do is they somehow, the rider, which is like the conscious self, the egoic self, I would say, the rider is convinced that they don't need this person anymore. I'm done. It's over. I'm going to go off and do my own thing now. I'm going to be free. Being single is going to be so cool. And I'm just like going to go like mac on hella babes and just like be free. And like, I can't wait for it. And like, so they break up with their girlfriend and they go on to the single life. And the writer is convinced that they're going to be fine.
Yeah.
And this is actually going to be way better. And they're super excited about it. And then 2 weeks pass by. And it's like, I really miss my girlfriend. Oh, shit. Being single isn't that cool, actually. I'm just basically alone. Meeting girls is hard. Oh, wow. I don't realize the role this person played in my life. Oh, my God. I wasn't paying attention at all. Like, oh, God, can I undo this? Can I undo this? Baby, 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 baby. Like, I want you back. Like, oh, my God, I don't know what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And again, like, this is a stereotypical experience that I think a lot of people have experienced themselves.
Yeah.
Or they've seen someone to go through this, where, again, it's almost like this individual was not in touch with themselves. They didn't realize all these things happening underneath the surface that attach this person to their partner, to their romantic partner.
Yeah.
And that's the elephant, right? The elephant is the lower under the surface self who actually feels all these deep things that the rider is not in touch with. And the rider's like, come on, elephant, we're going to be single. And the elephant doesn't care. The elephant wants what it wants. And in that moment, it wants to be back in the relationship.
Yeah.
And you have this weird moment of like, I don't know what I was thinking. Why did I do this? What the hell was I thinking? And it's this disconnection. It's this clash.
Yeah.
And the disconnection sort of feels like there's different versions of yourself that aren't in connection with each other.
Yeah.
They're not in contact.
Yeah.
And that's, again, this metaphor of the rider and the elephant.
Yeah. So would you say that someone with a higher emotional intelligence, or however you might want to say that, someone who's more in tune with themselves is more in tune with the elephant, with their beast?
Yeah.
And an individual who just found themselves in this situation where they didn't realize how deeply connected they were to their partner and is now like the elephant is rampaging, has lost a connection or maybe never had it truly with that emotional deep need that the elephant is. In some ways, the elephant has been connected to that person the whole time, but the rider hasn't realized it.
Right.
So what do we do for a person like that? How do they become more in tune with that elephant, with the needs of the elephant?
Well, it's a complicated question. I mean, there's a lot of strategies. I think any personal work, any inner work, any self work, however you want to phrase it, there's all these different forms of that. But a lot of it is aimed at getting more in touch with yourself.
Yeah.
And again, like it's like, what the hell does that mean? Getting more in touch with yourself? How can you be out of touch with yourself?
Because that same person might then get into another relationship eventually and find themselves in maybe not the exact same situation, but something might arise, that cycle of once again not recognizing these deeper needs, deeper feelings, the other part that's just not being recognized.
Right.
Once again finds themselves in a situation where they're in a freak out.
Right, repeating patterns.
Right, repeating patterns.
And that's again any bad habit that keeps happening to someone, any repeated pattern that's sort of like this pattern that they can't seem to control, and even more explicitly, they can't seem to explain it.
Yeah.
Like, wait, why are you back together with this person again? I thought you said it was over, and you laid out all these reasons why it didn't make sense for you guys to be together, and now you're together again. And the person you ask that question to, the thing that you're talking to is the writer. And the writer's like, I don't know, the elephant just kind of keeps doing this stuff and I don't know what to tell you, because it's like a public relations agent, right? The writer serves the elephant and the writer is saying, I don't know. The elephant wanted to get back together with Marcia.
Well, the friend will be like, hey, man, like, why are you back together with your girlfriend who you were fighting with all the time and you said you weren't even in love with? And you'll be like, well, like, we met up and she seems different and I seem different. Like, excuses, rationalize. Let me just pull something out of my excuse hat. Right. That's what the writer's doing. That's how it's... That idea of rationalizing in that sense makes sense to me. Yeah. That is what the writer is doing. It's suddenly realizes that they've found himself in this totally different place, and the elephant brought them there. So why? It's like, oh, well, let me tell you why. It's because this doesn't that make sense? And your friend might just be like, no.
Yeah. So you have this image of someone riding an elephant. And the elephant is just like eating something disgusting off the ground, like eating something that's not good for it at all. And you're like, dude, your elephant is like eating all that like nasty stuff. What are you going to do about it? And like you have this image of the rider on top of the elephant being like, hands up in the air, like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to tell you. The elephant is just, I can't control it. I can't control the elephant. The elephant is driving. The elephant goes where it wants. The elephant wanted to get back with Marcia, and I am scrambling to come up with some sort of explanation for the elephant's behavior, for why the elephant is walking down this path, and I seem to have no control over it. Yeah. And maybe here's a bunch of excuses. Maybe here's a bullshit story. Maybe I'll even lie to you.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll say, oh, well, it turns out that Marcia is dying of cancer or something like that, and I have to take care of her now. It's like people will actually do that and they won't realize what they're doing. They're trying to make up a story that's an excuse for their behavior. Yeah. Like a writer making an excuse for the elephant, being like, the elephant just trampled all over your garden, and fuck, how can I explain why the elephant did that? It's because the flowers were poisonous. That's the reason. The elephant did what it did. And so, we see people doing this all the time. in all kinds of ways. And it can be more subtle than that, and it doesn't have to be always so pejorative.
Sure.
Too. And in fact, when you think about someone who's in touch with their elephant, someone who the rider and the elephant have a good connection, you have the image of the rider with the reins, and the rider and the elephant are friends, and the rider feeds the elephant, takes care of it, and makes it feel loved. And when the rider says, "We're going right now, elephant," the elephant does it. And when the rider says, "Okay, we're going left now," the elephant does it. And there's a good relationship there. And that might look like, if we leap out of the metaphor into real life, that might look like someone who treats exercises every day. Let's say it's like I'm doing, like, why do you exercise? Isn't it painful and take up time, and don't you get kind of sweaty and gross? Doesn't it just seem kind of like a painful thing to do? It's like, yeah, it is, but like I know ultimately that it's good for me.
Yeah.
And what they're saying is like, it's good for my entire being, my entire self, my body. It's good for my body. It's like, wouldn't your body rather just like eat candy and drink a bunch of alcohol though? It's like, yeah, that is what the elephant might rather do, but it's not good for the elephant. And like, I know that like I want to take care of it. And every once in a while I reward the elephant. We have a deal. If the elephant has a good week at work and exercises every day and meditates and gets everything done on its to-do list, I let the elephant have one drink. It's like, oh, okay, that's nice. It's like you have a good relationship with your lower self. Or you can explain your lower self, and someone flips out, they have some crazy volatile moment where they get really pissed off. And when you ask them what just happened there, if the rider is in good relationship with the elephant, he can say, well, you know what? Sorry, I have some PTSD from a previous job situation in which I was being really undervalued and kind of like talked down to quite a bit. And it made me really sensitive. And I realize now when I feel like someone's talking down to me that I had this like really volatile, like sensitive, like traumatic response to it. And that's what just happened. I can actually explain what really happened just now.
Yeah.
You know why? Because the rider understands the elephant really well. So I can explain to you what happened.
Yeah.
And if I had a bad relationship between the rider and the elephant, I might say, I'm not angry. I didn't get pissed off just now.
Yeah.
Fuck you. Go away. Like, leave me alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's like the rider is just being like, go away. I can't explain what happened. I don't know what happened. I don't want to talk about it.
They don't want to acknowledge that there is an elephant.
Right.
They're the type of person who's like got the blinders on.
Right.
And even though they're on top of this big animal and it's walking along the path and it's tearing shit up because it's angry.
Yeah, maybe it's like ripping people's heads off or something. Like
the rider's still denying it, right?
Yeah, it's like, what heads? What decapitated people?
Yeah.
I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, and some people really do find themselves in situations like that because to turn towards the elephant, to recognize that there is this other part of you that is uncontrollable, quote unquote, is so destabilizing.
Yeah.
Or they're just not ready for it. Ego, the rider, you might say, is not strong enough to realize that they need to look down and see what's running the show.
Right.
Okay, I have a question.
Sure.
So, I still admittedly don't fully understand the metaphor, but if
Me neither.
If we just take it in a generalized direction and maybe not looking at maladaptive habits or things like that, but more so at natural intuitions, things that does the elephant sense things as the unconscious part of one's being and wants to kind of guide the rider, toward a different path. And that's just because maybe the elephant has an intuition, or maybe the elephant and all the elephants before it have always like walked this path and it knows it needs to turn down this way. And the rider can kind of be like, no. Or maybe they're in touch with it and they say, I feel this deep sense of movement in this direction and I go.
Right.
I like thinking about it that way. I don't know if that's right.
No, it's important.
I think it's important.
It's very important.
Yeah.
It's not as intuitive to think of it that way because we tend to focus on like negative things more than think of positive aspects of psychology.
That was part of what I was when we first started talking about this. I was like, this seems very Freudian to me. Like we're talking about all of these.
Right, and I think that's a misframing. And
right,
Freud's great and Freud's a genius, but
yes. We love Freud.
Honestly, I'm not even going to pretend I understand Freud at all. So I don't want to make any claims about what Freud is and is not, but I do get the feeling that sometimes when people talk about Freud or they're looking things through a Freudian viewpoint, they're kind of looking at it in this sort of more negative psychology way as opposed to a positive psychology way. Where it's like the unconscious is like this like sexual, lustful, disgusting thing, and like all we're trying to do is like fight back that thing, like that monster.
Yeah.
And like, but it comes out and it just like wants to fuck things, and like that's what the unconscious is. And it's like,
yeah, I mean,
is that all it is?
Right. Well, that was the split, right, between Freud and Jung, basically. Was
and that's a stereotype. Forgive me for stereotyping Freud. I don't want to claim that I understand Freud, but
no, it's to me when we were first talking about it, or even then when I started looking it up, because I haven't read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, where I think this is talked about a lot, but it was like, this seems
that's where we got the idea for talking about this.
This seems kind of in relation to the id, when we're kind of looking at a lot of these examples too, where it's like, oh, you find yourself calling your ex-girlfriend in the middle of the night. Whoops, why'd that happen? It's the elephant. It's like, is that all the elephant is, guys?
Yeah.
Like,
that is useful to point out, though, because there are, I think, a lot of people who are listening might be familiar with the idea of the id and the ego and the superego.
Right, yes.
Freud's paradigm.
Yes.
And it's not perfect,
it's not perfect.
I just said in a very strong, contrived way. It's not perfect, but the idea of the ego and the id from the Freudian perspective, if you have an idea of what the id is,
right.
This is kind of mapping onto the same idea. The id is the elephant,
right,
and the ego is the rider,
right? Because from the Jungian point of view, I'm like, oh, like I don't know about like the unconscious / elephant being just that. That's part of it,
right,
and I think,
right.
And but to that point, Freud came up with his theories because that is a manifestation that is incredibly prominent in the 19th century, but also in modern day, where we're seeing people.
It's the most salient example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why, like, let's think of an example. Well, okay, you're smoking, or okay, you have like this really bad habit. It's like, okay, that's true.
Right. So let's think of a less salient example, which is like a more positive example.
Well, that's what I was wondering, because to me, especially when I think about certain relationships to the unconscious of my own personality, there are those times that I find myself in bad habits. And I'm like, oh, damn it. Okay. But there's also times where I feel these big pulls in different directions in my life, and there's something else that's in control of that, and it's not me, it's not the ego, it's not the writer. So to me, it's helpful to at least flesh out this idea to encompass the recognition that maybe you've been working your job just day in and day out for a couple of years, and it's like, it's not that bad. But you start feeling this draw in another direction to want to pursue a career that taps into your artistic and creative skills when you've been in something that's not really that. Yeah. And there hadn't been any sort of conscious actions that had been cultivating that, you might say. Yeah. So where is this desire coming from? Where is this intuition coming from? Right. I would like to think that the elephant also has those capabilities that to pull you onto a new path that's good for you, and that's going to help you grow and become that version that you're meant to be.
Right. So this is important, and to keep up with the metaphor, as Alyssa just laid out articulately, we've kind of been describing sort of like a negative version of this, right? It's where like the writer knows what's best, and the elephant is just like this animal baby brat thing that like just like is doing all these terrible things. Right. And that's kind of like one version of this that manifests. But like, what about the opposite, where you have individuals who don't know how to follow their intuition? They don't know how they feel. Yeah. And if they would listen to their gut more, if they would listen to their instincts, if they would call upon the unconscious to guide them more, they would actually have an easier time navigating reality, navigating their life. And the unconscious might be like, I can feel that if you take this leap of faith, this is going to be good for you. But the writer might say, that's too dangerous.
Yeah. Oh God, no. No way.
I'm not going to listen to my gut on this. Like I can't trust my instinct or my intuition. Only logic all the time. Only rationality all the time. But often the elephant sees and hears and smells things that the writer can't, as animals often do. Yeah. Which is kind of almost why the original version of this metaphor for me, I actually just came up with on my own. It was a dog, and that made more sense to me. because like dogs like eat trash and like we're around them all the time. And they do stupid things like that. But dogs smell better than we do. They hear better than we do. They see things that humans can't.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
So the elephant, let's say, the elephant knows that at the top of the mountain, there's this great treasure. It can just feel it somehow. It can smell it. And it can be like, it's trying to take the rider up the mountain because it knows that like going up the mountain is like the right path.
Right.
And the rider's like, what are you doing? Why are you taking us up the mountain? That's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
We don't have time for that.
Yeah.
And so the rider's like tugging on the reins and being like, elephant, no, where are you taking me? Where are you taking us? But the elephant actually knows something the rider doesn't. And if the rider would just say like, okay, I'm just going to let you go.
I trust you.
I trust you.
Yes.
That the elephant would actually lead the rider to this great treasure.
Right.
And that's what our intuition is often telling us.
Yes.
And there's a lot of people, and I mean, I would include myself in this. There's like a deep drive in me that's instinctual. It's intuitive that guides me towards things.
Yeah.
And if people ask me, what are you doing? Like, I'm like, I don't know exactly. I just know this is right.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, can you lay it out for me? Can you map it out for me? What your path forward is? What's your 5-year plan? It's like, I don't have a 5-year plan. I don't know. I can't explain it to you. I just know this is the right direction.
Yes. I think we should do an episode on intuition.
Yeah.
By the way, just throwing that
Haven't
out.
we?
No.
Intuition and sensing. We taled about doing that.
Right.
Well, that's the typology.
Yeah, typology.
But we could just focus on intuition as a concept.
Yes, because this is already like, this would be really interesting to get into, but we can't because we don't have time. But part of what you're talking about, I think, is really important. And to contrast that against this paradigm of the rider and the elephant in the one-dimensional way is why I think you need to expand your idea of what this is. Because if you go back to the original ideas, or even if you look this up online, what you might see, it's like the writer is rational. He rationalizes. He's going to look at things that are real and just think about this more clearly. And the elephant's so emotional and yada, yada, yada. Yeah. But when the elephant is trying to take you up the mountain because it sees and hears and senses and knows that there's something up there that you need, the writer who wants to fight it is not going to be able to rationalize truly what is at the top of that mountain because it can't see it. Yeah. And it's probably operating from this place of fear and uncertainty. Yeah. And it's tapping into that same thing where we might have said like the elephant is scared or the elephant needs the cigarette or whatever. So it's like we're almost sort of flipping it a little bit, but it's important to recognize that the writer, the ego is not always going to be able to understand things in enough depth and complexity. Right. And it might be feeling deep emotional instability. Yeah. And it might be trying to rationalize, quote unquote, based on that instability that it's feeling while there's something else that's trying to drive it towards growth, transformation, development, etc. So this paradigm ultimately is, to me, it comes back a lot to the constraints that the writer has, that ego consciousness has. And if we just recognize that that is true, that there's parts of us that might be more damaged than we realize, that might be stronger and more intuitive than we realize, then we can just have more openness, flexibility, curiosity about what we're feeling, what we're sensing, what we're thinking, feeling, and not be so restricted with ourselves or not be so one-dimensional, and to open a conversation. Because that's, to me, what recognizing the different dimensionalities of consciousness is all about. It's about opening conversation and letting that flow and seeing where it takes you and following intuitions when it feels right and maybe holding back when you need to. But just recognizing that if you feel fear, it might be the elephant, but it might also be the rider in some ways.
Right. So it's important to not attach too much good and bad to the rider and the elephant. It's not the right way to look at it. Yeah. And again, I think it's better to think about it as a thing of depth. What's surface level and what's under the surface, or what's conscious and what's unconscious. More so to think of it as something that knows what's best and something that is stupid and needs to be controlled. And that's like a very rationalist way of looking at the world, honestly. Just like rationality rules, and I guess that's just like the way to like the promised land is to be rational, and therefore you must deny like all instinct and intuition. Like that's unfortunately a lot of people have kind of found their way into that sort of way of thinking, which.
Well, understandably.
I mean, again, it's hard to. What are we even talking about? But being in contact with the unconscious self, being in contact with the animal self, being in contact with like the child self, the inner child. That's what spirituality is often aimed at. That's what when we think of self-work or inner work, we're talking about this. We're talking about connecting the hierarchical structure of self, the higher to the lower, to be fluent in moving through both, to be fluent in understanding what both are. And so you can listen to your feelings and you can embrace your pain and you can look at your memories from the past that maybe hurt you, and you can be in touch with them and integrate them. And that, in some sense, is the writer understanding what the elephant wants and what it needs and not trying to fight against it. Understanding that the writer can't control the elephant, no matter what, no matter what you do, the writer cannot get down and push the elephant down the path. Yeah. It can't do it. Like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Yeah. Like that's a really old saying. And that's the thing. It's like you cannot make the elephant do things, but you can develop a better relationship with it. Yes. And that's, that's what therapy is. Yeah. There's all different kinds of therapy, but like what is it aimed at? It's like, it's aimed at, first of all, you go to a therapist because you need help. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't go if you didn't need the therapist to do something for you. And that implies already a disconnection with yourself. I don't know how to fix this. Yeah. Something is wrong with me, like not just like my life, but like with me. And I don't know how to fix it. Yeah. You go to someone who can help you fix it. And that really demonstrates that there's a disconnection within yourself. The writer doesn't know how to control the elephant, or the elephant's scared and the writer can't get it to do anything. Or the elephant keeps flipping out and getting into these crazy tantrums, and the writer doesn't know what to do about it. Yeah. And you go to a therapist, and a therapist, what they're hopefully going to do is they're going to find a way to bridge that gap. And they can't do it either. They can't bridge the gap, but they can hold space for it. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so, so this metaphor is useful, and it's nothing new. I mean, this just ties into everything we've talked about on the podcast so far. In many ways, the elephant is the shadow. The shadow does not encapsulate the elephant, nor does the elephant encapsulate the shadow. But I would say that, like, when we're talking about the golden shadow, we're talking about getting in touch with the elephant, getting in touch with what you're not aware of or what's underneath the surface can lead to great power and great strength. And all the things we've laid out in the podcast so far are ways of doing that. If you want to figure out what the elephant needs, journal. Yeah. What comes out when you journal?
Yeah, there's no simple answer. Yeah. It's everyone's elephant, what it's gone through, what has defined it, what it's adapted to act and to sort of translate to the writer is going to be highly dependent on your life and your experiences. But it is about, first and foremost, recognizing that the elephant is there, or that the part of the personality is the greater unconscious aspects, and that there might be some more difficult, shadowy elements to this elephant, or there might be some really strong, powerful dynamics to this elephant, and you just haven't been listening to it. Maybe you're someone who has a really strong relationship to it. Maybe you're someone who denies it completely. No matter what, we all have this opportunity to open up this greater conversation to these parts of ourselves, and to recognize that the elephant has many of its own desires and motivations, and it's about recognizing them in all different areas of your life. So how can you open that connection? How can you be more in tune with the elephant? How can you shift your environment and your mindset to be open to what the elephant has to show you, and how you can learn from it, but at the same time, how you can be more connected and more in tune?
And now it's time for a dream from a member of our audience. This is from a 30-year-old female, and here's the dream. There was an upstairs neighbor in a rickety apartment complex of the sort I've never lived in. He was an old, thin man, someone that everyone understood was to be ignored. There was shared sound with the neighbor, and joy, or at least warmth. There was a small device that fit in the palm of my hand, gold, a device that made sound to share. I closed my hand around it, and it was precious.
So I think it'll be helpful to have a little bit more context, because I feel like this dream, at least what we've received, is like a snapshot of a very interesting symbol and representation for this dreamer. Mm-hmm. So she writes that she's been gradually recognizing that the role of a music teacher, which she is to facilitate human beings being in time and in tune with each other. So there seems to be a certain realization happening for her at this time that the role that she's playing as a teacher of music is to create connection for individuals, and to step into that role to embody that is to facilitate an experience where not only is she teaching a skill, but she's also teaching people how to create relationship to one another. And this dream to me seems to be a very interesting symbol of that embrace. And I'd be very curious to know if there's been certain resistance to this role, or if there's been a sense of, or in some ways at least, discounting the importance of being a music teacher, because we have this old man who is in this rickety apartment complex.
Yeah.
And it's someone that everyone was supposed to be ignoring. So some part of her, which the old man is imaging in the dream, some part of her own psyche is being ignored, pushed aside. And he's in an apartment complex. So that brings up that kind of universal symbol of the house, or some sort of space of living, which is often, that structure of the psyche, the dynamics of the psyche.
Yeah.
So some part of her has been kind of banished. And yet, as the dream continues, they create music together. There's this shared sound with that neighbor, and it's joy and it's warmth and it's connection. So depending on what's been going on with this dreamer, there might at least be a certain reinforcement that this dream is having for her, which is to say, if you've been coming to a certain understanding of the role of being a teacher of music and how important that is actually for individuals, that this dream is helping affirm that for her.
Right. The dream kind of seems like an epiphany. And who knows if this is the kind of dream where like the dreamer shot up out of bed and was like, Eureka! Like, I realize now the true path. Like, maybe, I mean, it kind of sounds like it.
Yeah.
Hard to know. I mean, maybe the dreamer chose this dream specifically because it stood out as being meaningful in that way. But there is a realization, there's a shift that happens through the dream where, as you said, it's hard to know. It's like, is this a part of her that's been ignored, or is it kind of more like an external thing where it's like she actually just like doesn't see people for what they are, or she's not allowing herself to actually empathize or connect with people as much as she should, and then she realizes that part of teaching is doing that.
Yeah,
that it's not just like this mechanistic thing. Like, I don't know, like putting together like a meal as much as it's like bringing people into harmony with each other. Like, that's what it means to be a teacher.
Yeah.
Something like that. I mean, it's hard to know, but definitely this old man that's... It's understood that he was to be ignored. Like, it's an interesting way to phrase it. Like, everyone's agreed that we're going to ignore this.
Well, that's
old
what's
man.
interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's there's some sort of conscious attitude or known attitude amongst all of the neighbors or whoever that this old, thin, creepy, weird man is to be ignored.
Right.
It
implies social pressure. And is it actual external perception?
Sure.
Where it's like, I'm being expected to behave this way, therefore I am, and I realize I don't need to do what's expected of me anymore. I can actually do what I feel.
Sure.
Or maybe the social pressure is like the different parts of the self exerting pressure on the more feeling part or the more empathetic part.
Yeah. This is certainly where the dreamer's own discretion and ability to sort of decipher the more subjective, either, these are internal parts of myself, or is this a commentary on like a outer situation?
Right.
And that's what's so interesting about dreams, is it can kind of flow between all these different possibilities, but that discernment kind of comes from your own knowing. So, right now we're giving ideas and possibilities, and sort of fleshing out some of these symbols. But those, even within those 2 first lines of this dream, we have so much interesting insight.
Yeah.
You know, the old thin man, what does he represent? And
it's just like the saddest symbol that it could be.
Yeah.
It's like an old man that everyone has agreed to ignore.
It's
like
sad.
there's nothing sadder than that. And that's like interesting because like it's maybe like the dream has conjured together an extreme symbol to represent like the universal ignored person who is in a rickety old apartment that's falling apart. The apartment has been ignored as well. So it's a place that is falling apart because it doesn't have love.
Right. Yes.
And it's a great dream. I mean, the way it's written is quite nice, and it makes it really easy for us to examine it.
Yeah.
And so if you're listening, write in your dreams like this.
Yes. A couple of interesting notes in this dream, I think, is that there's this small device that fits into the palm of her hand. Yeah. And it's gold. A device that makes sound.
That golden object. It's always appearing in dreams.
Isn't it interesting?
It's so interesting.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if it's actually in the dream. Is it like, oh, this is clearly gold, I can tell, and I push on it and it clearly has the consistency of gold? Or is it more like an object of light? You know?
Yes.
Like that seems more to me like there was an object of light in your dream, and when you woke up, you projected onto that like, oh, it's gold.
Yeah.
But light is, I think, clearly an archetypal, deeply ingrained, pre-conscious thing, the object of light.
Right.
And that appears in the dream.
Yeah. And this is a device that makes, you know, this sound that is to be shared. So there is that dynamic between there being that separation early on in the dream from the old man, and then moving towards connection and harmony, you know, and she closes her hand around it and it feels precious. It's something that has this emotional tone to it. So there's something about this device that makes this, you know, harmonizing sound that connects her maybe to the neighbor, or maybe connects like the whole apartment building. We don't even know what's happening, but certainly there's a very interesting transition that's happening here. Yeah. And one of, I don't know, kind of parts being disparate to coming together, like those harmonizing notes. So the dreamer does mention that she put together a recital recently, a student recital for individuals in a care home. Assuming that means like an old folks home, nursing home, things like that. And so she seems to be conducting something with her students, and as the teacher, that's creating harmony, connection, emotional depth for people. So this dream, a beautiful affirmation, maybe it's kind of shining a light on that more disconnected part, an invitation to kind of continue to bring that part forward, or to examine how that old, separate, damaged part might be still prominent in her life. But hopefully these give her a couple of nice ideas to consider.
Do you have a question for us? Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze? Is there a topic you'd like us to cover?
We want to hear from you. Contact us through the submission form, which can be found at our Instagram page at Golden Shadow Podcast. Or if you're listening on YouTube, you can find the link in the description down below.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Golden Shadow Podcast. Thank you.